Good day, classmates. Good day, Mrs. Conde. Thank you to my partner, Miss Rinalyn Hamo, for discussing the first part. Now, let's jump into the famous Victorian writers and poets. So after this discussion, we'll able to know who are the famous writers and poets of Victorian age. And we will know why are the female writers in Victorian age use masculine pseudonym in producing their works. So are you now ready? Alright, let's get started! During the Victorian era, the writers began to reflect the realities of the day, including the dangers of the factory, the plight of the lower class, and the treatment of women and children. So the most prolific and well-regarded poets in Victorian age included Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and many other poets in Victorian age. So who is Alfred Lord Tennyson? Alfred Lord Tennyson was a renowned poet in Victorian era. His works includes In Memoriam, The Charge of the Light Brigade, The Idylls of the King, Ulysses, and many more. Among all of his works, In Memoriam was the most famous. It is a poem consists of 131 sections, a prologue, and an epilogue. In fact, it is the favorite of Queen Victoria, who was soothed and pleased by it after the death of her husband, Prince Albert. Indeed, In Memoriam was considered one of the great poems in the 19th century. So next is Robert Browning. Robert Browning was a prolific Victorian-era poet and playwright. Both Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson were considered as a Victorian England's most famous poets. Robert Browning was famous for his blank long-form poem called The Ring and the Book. It is a story of a Roman murder trial in 12 books, and he was married to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So who is Elizabeth Barrett Browning? Elizabeth Barrett Browning was a Victorian poet and is best known for her Sonnets from the Portuguese. It is a collection of 44 love sonnets and became one of her seminal works and one of the greatest sequence of sonnets in history. So the collection was dedicated to Robert Browning and is written secretly during their courtship. In fact, Robert Browning wrote Elizabeth Barrett letters. They exchanged nearly 600 letters over the following 20 months, which led them to marriage. So those are the famous poets of Victorian age. Actually, there are still many poets that gives rise to Victorian age. You may also research some of them if you want to. So now, let's proceed to the famous Victorian writers. But first, let us answer this question. Why do female writers in Victorian age use masculine pseudonym in producing their works? So here are the reasons. First, to publish without prejudice in male-dominated circles. Second, to experiment with the freedom of anonymity. Third, to encourage male leadership. And lastly, to discourage female stereotyping. So those are the reasons why do female writers hide themselves, hide their identity, and use instead of masculine pseudonyms. Okay, going back to the famous Victorian writers. So first we have Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is the most famous Victorian novelist. He is extremely popular in his days and remains to be one of the most popular authors of the world. His first novel was The Pickwick Papers, whom he wrote when he was only 25 years old. Next is Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was an important Victorian novelist. His most notable works includes Under the Greenwood Tree, Far from the Madding Crowd, Mayor of the Castor Bridge, Tis the Overvilles, Jude the Obscure, and many more. Another is the three Bronte sisters. They produced notable works in this period, although they were not immediately appreciated by the Victorian critics. The three Bronte sisters were named as Anne Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, and Emily Bronte. These three Bronte sisters used masculine pseudonyms in producing their works. For Anne Bronte, she used Acton Bell as her pseudonym. Her famous work is The Tenant in the Wildfell Hall. The Tenant Wildfell Hall was considered as the first sustained feminist novel. For Charlotte Bronte, she used the pseudonym Currer Bell, and her famous work is The Jane Eyre. And for Emily Bronte, she used the pseudonym Elise Bell, and her famous work is The Wuthering Heights, which is her only famous work, is only work and examines class, myth, and gender. So another famous Victorian writer that used masculine pseudonym in producing her work is Mary Ann Evans, or also known by her masculine pseudonym George Eliot. She was an English novelist, poet, journalist, translator, and one of the leading writers of the Victorian era. Among his 7 novels, Middlemarch was her best-known works and is widely considered to be one of the greatest novels ever written. So now we are the last part, the trivia. So here are the trivia that happens in Victorian era. So first, Charles Darwin's work on the origin of species was published in England in the year 1859 throughout the Victorian era. Yes, you heard it right. Second, the most notably Oxford English Dictionary was also published during the Victorian era, which became to be the most important historical dictionary of English language. And lastly, the Dictionary of National Biography and the 9th edition of Encyclopedia Britannica was also published during later Victorian era. And that was all my report for today. This is Melanie August Bulawan, and thank you so much for listening. I hope I made myself clear. Thank you so much. God bless and keep safe.